Hi, let's begin this video by talking about what is grief. To me, grief is always the death of something. It is the death of someone we love. It is also, I think about a breakup as the death of the relationship. I think of a divorce as the death of the marriage. I think of a job loss as the death of that paycheck with those people in that place. So I think one thing that works against us is when we sometimes will think for losses other than death. Mine doesn't count because it's not a death. And your loss counts. We're going to be talking a lot about this. Your loss counts. Your trauma counts. This matters. Whatever it may be, I'm glad you're here and you're going to find some relief. So when we talk about grief, grief is a reflection of a connection that has been lost. We grieve those we love. We grieve those we like. We grieve those we dislike. We even grieve those we hate. We don't grieve people we're indifferent to. So we get connected to people. It can even be someone you've never met. We've all been connected to perhaps a singer who died or a well-known figure because they connected us to parts of our life. So grief is about connections. And your grief is as unique as your fingerprint. No one else is going to have your grief. Literally, even if your parent dies, your siblings are going to grieve differently because your relationship was different with that parent. So all of us have the most unique grief in the world. Now, when we talk about grief, there's big griefs and there's small griefs. We talk about those as micro and macro. It's not to ever imply anything's less than another. We can grieve over people. We can grieve over places. We can grieve over things. If your house burns down, that's a grief. If your loved ones die, of course, that's a grief. A divorce, of course, that's a grief. If you've been robbed, something's been stolen from you that mattered, that you were connected to, that's a grief also. Having a wedding canceled, having a trip postponed or canceled, all those are ways that we grieve. So in this video, I'm going to be talking about the death of a loved one, but everything I say, please apply that to other losses. Later on, we're going to go into very specific losses that there'll be videos for, but still know that everything I talk about around the death of a loved one many times can be applied to what you're going through, because it can be applied to estrangement, to a job loss, whatever it may be. It can always be applied. One of the things that happens is we can compare our losses. The moment we hear there's big and little losses, we want to go into comparison. And the mind likes to compare. But the reality is, when we compare, first of all, if you win, you lose. And you've left your heart. And grief is of your heart. You've left your heart and you've moved into your mind. So we talk about what's the worst loss? Is the worst loss a spouse of 40 years? Is it a child? Is it this? Is it a terrorist attack? All that. And some people will go, well, no, it's my loss. The reality is, when people ask me which is the worst loss, my answer is always yours. Your loss is the worst loss. And I think sometimes we forget we want our grief witnessed. We want it to be seen by others and not compared. Some people mistakenly think that grief is like a pie. That if you've got some grief, you're taking away a piece of mine. And that's not a reality. In the pandemic, I was walking with a friend one day safely and all that as we were doing. And I met one of my neighbors and she says, "Oh, you work in grief, right?" And she started crying about how she had to cancel her wedding and how much that meant to her. And it was going to be postponed for she didn't know when, for 3 months, 6 months, or a year. And she was so sad about it. And I was comforting her. And after she walked away, the person who was with me went, "That was just horrible for her to go on and on about her wedding when you've had a child die." And I go, she didn't take part of my grief by having some of her own. I'm very secure in my grief. Your loss doesn't take away from mine. We all get to have different losses. So that's so important to think when we talk about this idea of comparing. To find security in your grief. If someone else has grief, they get to have it and you get to have yours. Another concept to think about is I can't see your grief. Grief is what's on the inside. Mourning is what we do on the outside. I can't look at one person and go, "She's crying more than she is. She's got more grief." I can never see your grief. I can only see your acts of mourning on the outside. You'll hear so many times people go, "Well, you look fine." Okay, doesn't mean I'm not in deep grief. You can't see it. And so everyone grieves in their own way. It's really important to know that other people are going to grieve differently than you, and you're going to grieve differently than them. And that's okay. I often talk about, you come from a long line of dead people. Literally every ancestor you have had has died. There's something built into our soul, our psyche. We know how to do this. You don't have to be trained in this. You were built to handle a number of hits this lifetime. You were actually built to handle loss. But what went wrong? Why do you even need this course or books? Because our society has now taught us to be strong, to be productive. Those feelings are weak. Get over it. Move on. And that has really harmed our healing and some of the most natural things that we would do. So grief has now become hidden away many times in our world. And because we have so few models, it's easy for you to think you're doing grief wrong. And you can't do it wrong. And when we buy into what society says, we also begin to judge ourselves. And we have expectations of ourselves. And so many times I'll say to people, "You're judging yourself." And they're like, "No, I'm not. I just think I should be further along." And I say, well, that is a judgment that you are in the wrong place in your grief. And you're never in the wrong place in your grief. So one of the questions that comes up a lot, how long will I grieve? How long is my sister, my wife, my husband, my partner, how long are they going to grieve? Whenever anyone asks me how long someone's going to grieve, I always say, well, how long is a person going to be dead? Because if they're going to be dead for a long time, you're going to grieve for a long time. But that doesn't mean you will always grieve with pain. My work in this video series and with others in my online groups is to help people in time grieve with more love than pain, but at their own pace and in their own way. Now, in divorce, it's different. When we talk about other types of losses, it may not be about loving that person anymore. It may be how present can you be to release the pain and find the growth. That's what it may be after divorce or a breakup. When I think about the timeline in grief, I always tell people there is no timeline in grief. There are certain markers that I use when working with people. It helps me know where they are in their process. So let me line them up just a little bit for you. The first one is what we call anticipatory grief. Anticipatory grief is a healthy grief we all go through. You've been in anticipatory grief, probably working on that a lot of your life. We grow up knowing ever so slightly in the back of our mind, someday our parents are going to get old and die. And that's that anticipatory grief working very slowly. Then comes the day someone we love and know will have a diagnosis. And when they get the diagnosis, we may go to a deeper level of anticipatory grief. We know that it could be closer. And this is a healthy process that we do. We'll talk about later on in some of the other videos how it can become unhealthy, cause catastrophizing, cause anxiety. So that will come later. But for now, it's this anticipatory grief comes before the death. Then when the death occurs, we then go into the acute phase. The acute phase is when it's just happened in your world. It is different for everyone. For some people, the acute phase is a week or a month. Others, it's 6 months, 9 months. There's no one right place that fits everyone. But when you're in the acute phase, it feels like it just happened and you were in free fall. And like I said, that can last for months. You were in free fall. When people are beginning to come out of the acute phase, they will say things like, I feel like I'm just beginning to catch my breath. I feel like I'm just beginning to get my feet on the ground again. You are not done with the grief. You are far from over the grief, but you've sort of found a floor. You're not in that free fall anymore. But remember, that's different for everyone, even members of your own family. Everyone's going to do it differently. Then we go into what I call early grief. Now, I want you to think about what early grief is. If I went down to the local busy street or a shopping mall and said to people randomly, what's early grief? People would say, early grief? I don't know. What's that, the first 3 days? Early grief, is that the first month? Early grief for me, I believe, is your first 2 years of grief. And that's not even an exact number. We're all a little different. But many people, it brings a shift to realize, oh, something's not wrong with me. I'm not doing it wrong that I'm still feeling such intense pain. I'm actually still in early grief in those first 2 years. Then we move into what I call mature grief. And that is where we can work on eventually finding more love than pain. So, but think about how if you didn't know this layout, you might think that we're doing it wrong, and you're not. One of the fears we have around grief is it's going to be too much. It's going to be overpowering. People will tell me all the time, I can't cry. If I start crying, I'm going to cry forever. Or I just can't stop crying now. I want to tell you, I have been with thousands and thousands of people who are crying. Everyone has eventually stopped crying. It is not true that you will never stop crying. Or people are afraid if they feel their anger that they're going to let, it's never going to stop. So just know there will be a shift or a change in your feelings. You feel one, another one will come. The only way out of the pain is through the pain. In the last book I wrote, Finding Meaning, it was interesting. I was researching, and I never thought I'd be saying this, researching buffaloes. Right? Buffaloes in a grief book. Who would have thought it? But It turns out when buffaloes sense a storm coming, they actually run into the storm. And by running into the storm, they minimize the pain. They minimize their discomfort. They minimize how long they're in the hard part. What do we do with grief? We run from grief. We keep it like 10 feet behind us or a mile behind us, and it becomes this steady companion that just makes our life miserable. So the idea that you're doing this series will help you immensely to really be present for it. The reality is we cannot heal what we don't feel. So we have to feel it. We have this inclination in our society that we should fight it. We should want it to be over. But we have to feel it. Even when people around us are saying, you've got to move on. It's time to move on. Shouldn't you be over it by now? Maybe you sometimes tell yourself, I should be further along. I should move on. But you have to stay present for the feelings. I know they're intense. I know they're hard. But we have to stay present because what we resist persists. So just look at, do other people have those expectations? You should be over it. Do you ever have those expectations? As I've already mentioned, the reality is you're not broken. You don't need fixing. And when we hear those comments like, isn't it time you moved on? Or you've got to get over them, it can easily feel like people think you're broken and need fixing. So don't take that on. What we do need is we need our grief to be witnessed. We need to be seen. We need other people to see this pain we're in, that this loss mattered. You know, we talk a lot about, in science, there's this concept of we have mirroring neurons. And mirroring neurons, we talk about often in babies, that babies have these mirroring neurons. You can see videos on the internet, on YouTube, about the baby sitting with their mom, and the mom smiles and the baby smiles back, and the mom looks and the baby looks, and the mom looks serious and the baby gets worried. The baby mirrors its mother. We forget that we don't grow out of those mirroring neurons. We still have them. I know it happened to me recently that I thought about it. I was just walking down the street, and as I'm walking down the street, a guy I passed went, howdy. And I went, howdy. I don't say howdy. I'm not a howdier, but he howdied me. I howdied him back. My mirroring neurons kicked in. We want to be witnessed. We want to be seen. We want to be mirrored by one another. And grief must be witnessed. You weren't meant to be an island of grief. We need others. I was touring in Australia. And when I was touring, I was doing a lecture in Northern Australia. And a researcher came up to me and shared how she does research on the little villages in the rural areas of Australia. And she shared how she went to this one village. And in the village, they said, the night someone dies, the day of the person's death, everyone in the small village moves a piece of furniture or something around them, but everyone has to move something the night of the death. And the researcher said, why does everyone do that? And she said, because the next day when the family wakes up, we want them to look around and see now that their loved one has died, everything has changed. Everything has changed now that their loved one has died. How different is that in our Western world? You wake up the day after your loved one dies and everyone's going about their business. You wake up the day after the breakup and it's life as usual for everyone else. You wake up the day after the divorce, the day after the betrayal, the pet loss, whatever you may have loved and lost. Everyone's like, just another day. And your world has been deeply, deeply shattered and thrown off balance. So it's to witness and to be present for yourself. When we talk about grief, I think about grief as a river. The river of grief will take you where you need to go. Some of us tiptoe slowly into the river of grief as our loved one's getting sicker and sicker, or we see the marriage getting worse and worse, or whatever it may be. We slowly tiptoe into the rivers of grief. Others of us are just having a random good Tuesday and we get a phone call out of the blue. Someone we loved has died or leaving us or whatever, and we are thrown into the river and we are drowning. But the river of grief will take you to your healing. The river of grief will help you figure out who you are now without your loved one. And if your loved one died, it'll help you figure out how to love them in their absence. You knew how to love them when they were present. The river of grief will teach you how to love them in their absence. Picture this river. You may see a little stick in the river. What happens if a stick falls in the river? The river hits it, the stream hits it, and just pushes the stick down the river. A little stick might be something like, just a little stick, a little complication, might be something like, I didn't tell them I loved them the day they died. And you feel bad about that for a bit, and then everyone reminds you how much your loved one knew you love them, and the stick goes down and just moves down the river, and the river's flowing again, right? However, maybe a huge branch falls in the river. What happens when a huge branch falls in the river? When a huge branch falls in the river, the water hits it, and it begins to swirl around in a circular motion, right? It's no longer flowing down the river. That's like our grief. It's going in a circle. We feel stuck. It's not going anywhere. Fishermen call this an eddy. It's just where the water goes in a circle and isn't flowing anymore. So that's big branch is what we call a complication of grief. You may have heard, oh, someone's got complicated grief. Complicated grief means a bigger branch fell in the river. What do we need to do? We need to examine the branch, witness it, talk about it, to heal it. A big branch that falls in the river of grief that complicates it is a death by suicide, an overdose, a sudden death, an unexpected death, the loss of a child. And what complicates my grief might not complicate your grief. So that's also unique. So we look at this complication to get the river flowing again. Where will the river take us? It will take us to our healing. So just think about that, this idea that there's nothing going wrong, but what does society tell you? Jump out of the river. You only got 3 days in the river. What are you doing in the river a year later? You should be out of the river in a year. Keep in mind, it means they don't understand it. So I hope some of these concepts will help you as you think about your grief, because what has happened to you matters. I want you to know, I take your grief seriously. I see your loss, your devastation that you're feeling, and your loss deeply mattered. And the person or what you've been through matters. And we are here for you. And together we're going to find a way to get through this, to find a life that you can live with peace, that honors you, and if it's been a loved one who's died, that honors them. For your homework, I'd love for you to think about this concept. If your grief could speak to you, what would it say? If your grief could speak, what would it say? What does it want you to know? And I'm purposely not giving you any examples because I don't want you to even have an idea of what I think your grief should say. Really think about, what does my grief want me to know? What do I need to hear? What do I need to see in my grief? Thanks.